We are very excited. Anytime and Kircher-Morris with us is always a great time. She spent time with our teachers this morning discussing a variety of things related to history. Now the research of so I don't want to take any more of your time. I'm always out of camera, but that's you're not here to see me, you're first. So let's go ahead and let you begin. Emily, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited. So I will make sure to kind of also talk about this. It's nice that you have the projection, but I will also try to stay in line with the camera. So, as I wonder. I'm really happy to be here. How many of you have been to one of the other talks that I've given here in the area? Yeah, I recognize a couple of places also. So just a little background about who I am and what I do. So I am a licensed professional counselor. And I specialize working with gifted and twice exceptional and neurodivergent kids and teens in my office in St. Louis, Missouri. I actually live in St. Louis, but prior to entering that part of my career, I worked as an educator. I taught in the general education classroom as well as in the gifted ed classroom, and I also worked for a while as a school counselor before I kind of made that shift. So all of those things have kind of led me to understanding who gifted kids are, what they really need. I am also the host of the Neurodiversity Podcast, which has grown like crazy. So if you listen to podcasts, I would recommend that you check it out. It's got about 250 episodes out and almost 2.5 million downloads. So it's really a great opportunity because I can call a bunch of experts in different areas and say, hey, can I just talk to you for half an hour? And they say yes. So that's kind of a little bit about me. I have a couple of books that I've published, but and a lot of what I'm pulling from today actually comes from my book, Raising Twice Exceptional Children, a handbook for parents of neurodivergent gifted kids. So in case you're unfamiliar with that term, twice exceptional, that refers to somebody who is both cognitively gifted and has another diagnosis or label layered on top of that, like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, something along those lines. And so we're going to talk about building executive functioning skills and understanding kind of how we can help our kids learn to self-regulate. Why some kids might have a hard time with this, what we need to do. So to start us out, we're going to talk about, first of all, just what is executive functioning and how do executive functioning skills impact kids and teens. So I think we can all relate to this a little bit, feeling this way at different times in our lives, where we just feel like overwhelmed by all of the things that we really have to do. How much room do I have? What really is my line?
Perfect, right there.
Okay.
Nope, both sides of the board.
All right. So part of what we're talking about executive functioning skills is the ability to prioritize tasks, organize them in a way that makes sense. And if we really struggle with executive functioning skills, we're probably going to end up feeling pretty overwhelmed quite a lot of the time. So when I talk to kids about executive functioning, and I'm explaining what exactly that is, I like to use an analogy. So specifically what I talk about is if you've ever been to the symphony and you get there before everything begins, you can hear the musicians tuning up their instruments. And so those musicians are kind of like our cognitive skills that we have that are operating in our brain at any given time. But while they're practicing, they're all practicing at different tempos and different keys, different parts of the music, just kind of getting warmed up and ready to go. When the conductor steps up and brings the baton and brings everybody into sync and they start playing together, that's when we hear the music. But that is like the executive functioning. Executive functioning is that part of our brain that brings everything into sync and has it all firing together in a way that makes it all work and come together. So when we're talking about executive functioning, what we're really discussing is this development of the brain that happens up here in the prefrontal cortex. So when you think about brain development specifically, the brain develops, you can kind of imagine it like your brain is like the fist here. So this part of your wrist right here is your brainstem, and it develops from the time that you're very young up and out. So then you've got your midbrain, which is responsible for emotional regulation, all these different pieces. You've got all these cognitive skills, and then that prefrontal cortex is the very last part of the brain that actually ends up developing. And as we know, the brains don't stop developing until mid-20s, which is why when I look back and I'm like, they let me go into a classroom with a class of students at age 21, I'm like, oh, that was fast. They shouldn't have let me do that. Because until you're really well into adulthood, what we consider adulthood, those things are all still coming online. They're all still really developing. But what's fascinating is that even when we just talk about gifted kids, there's an asynchrony. And we know that for a lot of our gifted kids, that process of development sometimes can lag behind their peers. So when we talk about asynchrony and giftedness, we frequently use this as a point of reference for how gifted kids' brains develop. So we know that a child who's 7 years old, chronologically, might have cognitive skills that are much more aligned with somebody who's 12 or 14 years old. They might have the verbal reasoning skills or the mathematical skills, logical problem solving. But a lot of those other skills tend to develop at a rate that is more commensurate with their chronological age. So for example, social relationships, right? Like sometimes those kids are a bit more mature. Sometimes there are factors just about that cognitive ability that can impact those social relationships. So it may even seem like they're a little bit less mature, but you have these profiles that have peaks and valleys of strengths and struggles that are different than what you might see with their same age peers, where that development tends to just kind of, go on its trajectory as you would normally expect. So when we look at the brains of kids who have intelligence that measures in the superior range, there are actually some differences that we can measure. And this is related to executive functioning. So the cerebral cortex is the gray matter, the outer part of that brain. And when children are very young, that cerebral cortex is pretty thick. And that thickness is associated with that rapid learning that children have when they're toddlers. You know how all of a sudden they're learning just hundreds of words in a week and developing all of these skills. They can jump and they can throw and all of these pieces that it's just, they're learning by osmosis just so quickly, where they just are absorbing all of this information. As kids get older, usually about the time they start to reach school age, that cerebral cortex begins to thin. That's associated with the pruning that goes on in our brains, where basically parts of your neurons that you're not really using, they just kind of, they're just not being used as frequently. And so we don't rely on them. And as that cerebral cortex begins to thin, that is also then associated with those executive functioning skills starting to come online. Usually by early elementary school, we can start to see some of that ability to self-regulate, to organize your materials, stay on track with things. Like that all starts to kind of happen. And so what's interesting, what's actually interesting is that the slide I thought was in here is not. And so the slide that I had thought was in here, and I don't know, I must have accidentally deleted it somehow. There's a graph, there's a study that they did where they actually measured the cerebral cortex of kids and then compared that to their cognitive ability. What they found was that children who had intelligence that measured in the superior range held on to that thickness of the cerebral cortex longer than their peers. Meaning that throughout all of those elementary school age, where some kids are starting to kind of develop some of those executive functioning skills, gifted kids actually maintain that ability to learn really rapidly for a longer period of time. And so when it does start to thin, usually by about 4th or 5th grade is kind of where you see most kids kind of really starting to have those executive functioning skills. For our gifted kids, it really may be that they're in late middle school before all those executive functioning skills kind of catch up to where their peers are. So there's a little bit of a delay there. And just because you have that difficulty with some executive functioning skills, that's just part of that asynchrony. It does not necessarily mean that a child is ADHD, which is often associated with executive functioning difficulties. However, we're talking mild difficulties. Like we're not talking about significant. There are definitely signs that if it's something more specific that you want to look at. But I find it fascinating that we can actually, they go through, they've done MRIs and measure the thickness of that cerebral cortex to see how that changes over time. So what does that mean? Gifted kids hold on to that ability to learn really rapidly longer, but that delays that onset of those executive functioning skills as they're building that. So you may see some of those difficulties. Sometimes there are kids who struggle functioning. It is really important for us to keep in mind that kids who struggle with executive functioning are not lazy. They're not unmotivated. This is a developmental trajectory that might be unique for them. If they are twice exceptional and they are both gifted and have another diagnosis, then that's part of how their brains are wired, and they might need some supports, they might need some tools. But it's so easy societally to pick up on the message that if you're disorganized or you struggle with time management, that's somehow like some sort of a moral failing. And it really isn't. And we want to make sure that our kids who maybe are struggling with that are not picking up on that message, because all that actually does is counterproductive. It actually inhibits them from then being able to build those skills or find the strategies that help them improve those skills over time. So let's talk about what are we really talking about? What is executive functioning, and what are the skills that we're really identifying here? So we can break this into two different categories. The first category of executive functioning skills are decision-making skills. So these are processes that are happening mentally, internally. So the first one is planning. I would also add prioritizing to it. When you have a task that you need to do, can you identify all of the steps? And can you then put them into a logical order? Can you recognize, like, if you have an idea, you know how sometimes kids have these very big ideas, lots of ideas, but the idea of, like, how do I get from here to there? They get lost in it a little bit. They're struggling with planning and prioritizing what those tasks might be. Time management is a huge one, although I actually prefer not to refer to this as time management. I think it's actually much more effective to call it time estimation skills. Because when we think about what we're being asked to do when we're managing our time, you can't manage your time if you don't know how long something's going to take. So like my husband, for example, thinks that everything will take 15 minutes. If we drive across town, you have to pay the garage, it doesn't matter, it's all just going to take 15 minutes, it'll be right there, it's no problem. Not great time estimation skills. But you have to be able to estimate how long your task is going to take in order to then move those chunks of time around in a logical order to make it effective, to use that time wisely. I didn't mention this, so I am ADHD. I'm also gifted, so I'm twice exceptional. I was identified with ADHD when I was a kid, which for girls especially was pretty rare back in the early 90s. And one of the, on my report card, always, I had a check mark instead of a plus. Uses time wisely. It's not my strength. And so now I'm so busy, I really don't have a choice. You know, it's like that urgency, that stress. It's like you have no choice but to use your time wisely because it is limited and you have a deadline. So, but we can help kids build time estimation skills, right? People will talk about time blindness, and which is kind of this term that means having a difficult time really processing how much time is going from, has passed when you're engaged in an activity. So you can use alarms and different things to kind of keep yourself on track. But when you're trying to estimate or manage your time, you can, like, I know exactly how long it's going to take me from the time I get out of bed to the time I'm going to walk out the door, depending on whether I have to wash or not my hair that morning. Like because I've done it so many times, I've collected that data, so I have a really strong average and knowing how long that's going to take. So so you can help kids. They may have a hard time judging the time as it's passing, but in advance, you can estimate and know, okay, I know my math is going to take me about 20 minutes to do, because that's how long it typically takes me. Then you're able to then kind of have an awareness of when you need to start and when you need to end. So you can have a range there. Organization is another one. So I have 3 kids, they're 16, 14, and 9. My middle daughter, organization is everything. She's one of those kids with a backpack that looks like it could explode really at any moment. If you open it up, you never know what you're going to find in there. It could be old food, it could be, I mean, who knows? I try to just avoid it. But organization, can you organize your materials in a way that is logical, that makes sense, that you can then find what those things are? There's a great website. This woman runs it. I don't remember her name off the top of my head, but the website is clutterbug.me, clutterbug.me. And what she does is she's like a professional organizer is what she is, but she's actually an ADHDer as well. And she talks about the different ways that people actually organizing. So there's actually a questionnaire or self-assessment that you can do there that kind of divides people into 4 different types of organizers. Are you somebody that needs things put away, or are you somebody who needs to be able to see the things? Like I'm a piler, right? And I like to have my files, but I know what's in the files. And don't move my files. Love my mother. She comes over and watches the kids when my husband and I have to travel for conferences and different things. And the next thing I know, she's cleared off my planning desk, and I'm like, those are my files. But recognizing that different people have those different organizational styles. If you have a child who struggles with organization, something that we often want to do is we want to help our kids organize the way that we organize. And if you are somebody who tends to be pretty organized, you might like a complex organizational system. So I find, especially a lot of times teachers really like to organize things. And so they'll help a student and try to organize things. And like, okay, we're gonna have these color-coded file folders, and you're gonna have all of these different pieces, and you're gonna put them in this binder or whatever. And for what it's worth, the kids are excited. They're like, yes, I love this. It seems, it's very new, it's very novel, it seems interesting and exciting. And then after a week, it goes out the window. Because it's too much for their brain. It's too complicated. They can't maintain it. So sometimes you have to think about simpler is better in those types of situations. What's a simple way? 1 folder, to do, done, right? Like, I mean, just try to really break it down and make it as simple as possible in those situations. And for what it's worth, if you have a child who's struggling with organization and your teacher has a particular organizational system that they are supposed to adhere to, you may want to have a conversation with that teacher and say, this isn't working. Can we try something different? Because they're just really struggling with this. Working memory is just our short-term memory. How well can we keep information in our brain for a short amount of time and manipulate it and then use it? So can somebody rattle off their phone number and then I remember it long enough to open up my phone and type it in, right? Or whatever it might be. You know, can my teacher give me 3 or 4 steps for a process or instructions? And do I start one and then forget what it is and then, you know, or am able to recall all 4 of them and go through all 4 steps? So working memory is really important. And then the last one is metacognition, thinking about thinking. When I have something going on, am I able to stop and reflect on it? Is this working or is it not working? And just being able to try to process that. Our second category are behavioral regulation skills. For the behavioral regulation skills. So the first one is response inhibition. Response inhibition specifically is talking about how well are you able to hold up impulse control. Can you stop the thing from coming out of your mouth before you say it and think about the consequences? A lot of kids struggle with response inhibition. They just are, you know, kind of. So for example, kids who rush through their work a lot of times are struggling with response inhibition. They're just like, they're not even reflecting on what they're doing as they're doing it. They're just getting their answers down and then they get mistakes. Task persistence and sustained attention are similar, they're related, but they are different. So sustained attention specifically is just how long can I sit and sustain my attention for a certain amount of time? How long can I listen to this woman talk without feeling like I need to check Facebook? You know, how long can I work on a particular task without feeling like I need to type? Task persistence is the ability to have, you know, follow through on multiple steps of a process. So can I start the task or all the way to finishing it? So one of my hobbies is collecting new hobbies. Anyone else do this too? And so I'm great at starting a new hobby and like kind of getting through it. And it's like, and then it's like, okay, well, did I ever actually finish any of the, you know, lots of crafting. I have lots of craft materials. My hobby is collecting craft materials. That actually is the hobby that I have. But going all the way from start to finish, you actually finish what it is you started. So for our kids, this could be as simple as, am I able to get home, get out my homework stuff, sit down at the table, start the homework, finish the homework, turn it, you know, put the homework back in my backpack, or hit the submit button, whatever it might be. And then, you know, go all the way through from start to finish. Or it could be longer term. It could be something that maybe takes, you know, a project that takes a few weeks, maybe longer. So a lot of times there are kids who have great task initiation, which we'll talk about down here. Actually, we'll just jump down to that one. So they start the task, but they don't have the task persistence. Task initiation is just what it sounds like. Can you start on it? It's procrastination if you're unable to get started on it. Shifting focus, I'm working on one thing, can I transition to something else? It's interesting, especially when we talk about ADHD. So a lot of times we do assessments in my office and we identify and diagnose ADHD and other things. And sometimes families will say, well, there's no possible way that they are ADHD because they can sit and focus on a video game or their Legos or whatever it is for a really long amount of time. First of all, are they, and then they can't always, pull away from it. So when we talk about ADHD, we're not calling it a deficit of attention is really a misnomer. Really what we're talking about is an inability to regulate our attention. So that could be, I'm getting distracted, I'm being pulled all over the place. Or it could be, I'm so focused on this thing that I'm totally unaware of what's going on around me. And when somebody calls my name, do I go, yeah, and then, but really, it's not even really entered my consciousness. I have that automatic response there. And then when I have to transition, am I able to kind of pause what I'm doing and then adjust and move over to this other piece here? And then the last one is cognitive flexibility. So cognitive flexibility is just basically if you try something and you attempt to have a solution for a problem and it doesn't work, are you able to come up with a different solution? And I always laugh sometimes. I heard somebody say this recently and it stuck with me, but they talked about kids who have a problem for every solution. So like we have a problem that's going on and you're trying to brainstorming, they're like, nope, won't work, nope, won't work, nope, won't work. And so they're struggling with cognitive flexibility, finding other ways to do it. So these are all, depending on who you look through or what books you read, like there are various lists of executive functioning skills. Sometimes some are a little bit smaller, some are even more expanded. But these are the ones that I feel like are really prevalent that I often end up working on with my clients to help develop some strategies. Another piece that is related to this is processing speed. A lot of kids struggle with processing speed. Not all, it kind of really depends, but especially kids who are twice exceptional and they are gifted and autistic. A common profile that you will see as far as intelligence goes, and this comes out of the University of Iowa with Megan Foley-Nickcon. But basically, they looked at profiles of twice exceptional kids who are gifted and autistic, and basically they often have very high verbal comprehension skills and very low processing speed. But processing speed can impact kids in a lot of different ways. So on this next slide, I have a little clip. This is from Dr. Ellen Braun. She wrote a great book called Bright Kids Who Can't Keep Up. And she's a psychologist. She works at, I don't know, one of the big hospitals up in the Boston area. UMass, is that one? I don't know, maybe not names. But anyway, she talks a lot about processing speed here. This is a clip from the podcast that I'm going to talk about processing.
Looking at how quickly someone is able to do kind of the really boring, mundane things in life. So, and the way we measure something like that is how quickly they can copy a code or how quickly they can name a certain number of words in a given period of time. But, one way to think about it is that there are just some kids who are naturally fast. They run, they talk, they write, they do all sorts of things at a rate that seems kind of appropriate or sometimes even fast for their age. And then there are other kids who have more difficulty doing that. And we're not talking about intelligence when we're talking about this. We're talking about kind of your ability to just get done with all of the little tasks that you have to do. Information processing speed it's been used a lot in neuropsychology, and we're using it more and more in fields like education and child development. But it really is, I'm sort of simplifying it, but in a lot of ways, it's a complex process. And so we define it and measure it in many different ways.
What would be a sign that this might be what's going on with the kiddo?
So it's funny, most parents would say it takes them forever to get anything done. Or a teacher might say, oh, Billy just can never find his papers and get them out of his backpack quickly enough or make it out to the playground in time. When parents complain or teachers might notice it, it just seems like, boy, he seems so smart. I just can't get anything done. But when we're talking a little bit more specific, it usually relates to one or more of three different areas. One is how well we perceive information, you know, like this can be through our senses, how well we kind of take in information, hear it, see it, how well we process it, meaning enact a kind of response, and then sort of how well we can organize what it is that we want to say. So it can be seen in a lot of different areas of functioning, and rarely is it ever about confidence of getting it done. It's not that sort of thing. We're not talking about not being able to perform the task, but not being able to do whatever it is at the time that it's supposed to be done.
What are some of the common clinical diagnoses where we might see some of this slow processing, and how does it fit into those diagnoses?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, when I started researching this topic, and it's been about 12 years now that I've been researching it, and it's still ongoing. We still have a lot of questions to answer. But it used to be thought of as sort of this slow processing speed profile that we used to assume it was ADHD. My research shows that that's not the case, although there's about a 60% overlap between kids with ADHD and kids with slow processing speed. So that means about 48% of them who don't have ADHD. And the second group of kids that I was always getting referred from my pediatrician or the teacher, they would say, you know, I wonder if this kid has some kind of like Asperger's, this is maybe so like Asperger's diagnosis, that Asperger's or some sort of autism spectrum, that just seems something off about their social skills. But they don't seem to completely have autism or Asperger's, but I need a second opinion. Many of those kids did not have autism or Asperger's, but they had slow processing speed, and the problems that they were having were really interfering with their social relationships. So they don't have the ability to be social, but just couldn't do it in real time. So those are the two of the bigger areas that we find kids with processing speed either fitting into the diagnosis of ADHD or seeming like they have some of the similarities of a child who might have a nonverbal learning disability. And then the other categories that we find are kids with learning disabilities. Many kids with learning disabilities will have slow processing speed as part of their profile. As many like 20 or 30% of kids with dyslexia or dyscalculia or dysgraphia also will have that. And their profile is a little bit different in their trajectory, their ability to access the supports that we put into place for them are a little bit different than kids who also have dysgraphia, for example, but don't have the processing speed deficit. And then another big group of kids we see who have this have anxiety. You know, it's sort of a circular thing where if you're sort of wired to have slow processing speed and also wired to be sort of a more anxious person, those two things can really feed off each other and really make life kind of difficult.
So processing speed is another thing that can impact all of those executive functioning skills. It's not an executive functioning skill in and of itself, but it has that interplay with each of those. So how can we help kids build executive functioning skills, right? How can we really help them do this? So what I will tell you is that, and Dr. Broughton would say this as well, but what you can't do is you can't speed up that development of that prefrontal cortex. That's going to happen at the pace it's going to happen at. So when we talk about building executive functioning skills, often what we're talking about is building the structures and the supports around whatever that executive functioning difficulty is that can help them be successful and help them be independent, even though it's maybe not coming as automatically to them. So there are a few things that we can do. And so basically, we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about rapport, explicit instruction supports, and then the task process. So first of all, it's really important that kids know that when we are helping them with these things, that we're not upset with them, we're not mad at them, we're not ashamed of them. And for what it's worth, we've all had a hard time with various things, probably executive functioning at various times in our lives. And so the more we can open up and just share about that and really help them understand, you know, sometimes I even have a hard time with executive functioning. When I get really stressed, my ability to organize goes out the window, and I have to do these other things to kind of help with that. Sharing those experiences is really important for kids to hear, because sometimes kids get this idea in their head that adults just have it all figured out and that they should be able to figure it out all on their own as well. And that's really just not the case. So we want to have those conversations We also want to approach this in a way where it's like, we're taking a team approach. We're really working with them to help build these skills, because like I mentioned earlier, kids internalize them, and if they're struggling with this, they really are going to internalize the fact that they feel like they're less than. They're less than their peers. They're less than what people expect from them. So I have another little clip from the podcast. This is from Brandon Mahan. He's the host of a podcast called ADHD Essentials. And he talks about the importance of helping kids. Like the minute that they start struggling with those executive functioning skills, the minute they start having a hard time with things, we want to make sure that we can try to get in there and help support them so that they know that there's a technical step that they can take to kind of help them through that.
I feel like a lot of times people who have executive functioning struggles, it's this constant mitigation of like, what do I have to do that people are going to see or know? Like for me personally, the time that my house gets cleaned is when there are people going to be at my house within the next 3 hours. Like that's when I go through and do that. It's very difficult to kind of manage that at other times.
That's why you invite people over.
That's true.
She probably had the same thing. That's probably why she invited people over.
It's actually my dad, I think, more than my mom, but yes.
So if you hear this and be like, she figured me out.
Yeah, but you know, it's like, what do you think are other things that get in the way? Because I think people just go, oh, wait, I'm just procrastinating, or it's more than that. Wouldn't you say?
No, it's the wall of waffle.
So explain the wall of awful.
Really, it's a trauma model. And so I'll walk you through it briefly. Some of the people who know me, he's talking about that again, but it's everywhere, guys. And those of you who don't know me, you're gonna go, that's really cool. I'm glad you talked about it. So the wall of waffle it extends beyond ADHD. Everybody has a wall of waffle. People with ADHD, because they fail more, have larger walls and have more of them. The wall of waffle is built when we fail. So every time we fail, we get a little brick in our wall as it relates to the specific task that we failed. And along with that failure brick, we get a disappointment brick because we disappointed ourselves. And we also get a disappointment brick for everyone whose opinion of us matters as it relates to that task. So if I'm a kid and I don't do my math homework, I get a failure brick for not having done my math assignment. I also get a disappointment brick from myself, one from mom, one from dad, and one from my teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And we also get a rejection brick for all those people who we assume we have disappointed.
Right.
And it doesn't matter if those people really disappoint us, and it doesn't matter if they really reject us. It's about our perception, not what really happens.
Mm-hmm.
So it's possible to get in there quick and forgive that kid. We're back to that forgiveness stuff. For having missed that math assignment, let them know it's not a big deal. They haven't missed the assignment in like 2 months. Don't sweat it, right? We have to get in immediately upon them realizing that they didn't do their math homework. If an hour goes by, it's too late. Then we have to work harder, and we're not going to take the bricks out. We can just make them a little smaller, or make them a little weaker, and it'll fall out later. But they're still going to land. And along with those disappointment and rejection and failure bricks, we also get guilt because I feel bad that I made the mistake. Shame if I feel like I am the mistake, because that's kind of the difference there is guilt is I feel like I made a mistake, shame is I feel like I am the mistake. And if I made the mistake because I have ADHD or because I have a memory challenge, then how do I tease those two things out? How do I keep the guilt from becoming shame? One of the things I advise my clients to do is just say sometimes the ADHD wins. Because sometimes it does, and you got to accept it. That's the only way to move past the challenges and avoid the shame and hold the guilt instead. Because guilt goes away, shame doesn't.
So fill in the blank here. You said ADHD, but just fill that in with anyone who's struggling with executive functioning, right? And we really want to focus because it ends up becoming like learned helplessness. If they constantly feel this pressure, they constantly feel like they're failing, then they stop attempting to improve that. Step 2 in this process is just recognizing that we need to help kids by explicitly instructing them on things. And this is the hard thing with gifted kids. Because gifted kids are so bright, and so even though they might only be like 7 years old, they speak as though they've already attended law school. And they can run circles around us, and they can, poke holes in all of our logic, and they can find all of the loopholes all of the time. And then when we ask them to do something simple, like go clean your room, they're like, they can't do it. They won't do it. And it seems often like willful defiance, but often what happens is we forget that they may not actually know how to do that. Think of how many steps go into cleaning your room. And if you struggle with executive functioning, like you might know, okay, my room's supposed to be clean and I'm here, but can I actually plan what that looks like? Can I stay on task long enough to get that finished? Do I actually know what it is? I mean, so like with my kids, we'll do a couple of different things. I'm big on check boxes and lists. I'm one of those people that like, if I have things to do, I like to put the things that I've already done on the list so I can check them off, so I feel like I've made some progress. Yes. But for my kids, sometimes we'll do that, or sometimes if it's too big of a task, I'll get out little Post-it notes or index cards and just put one item per card. It's like, okay, here are your cards. Let's think about this. Let's brainstorm, come up with all the ideas that you need, all the things you need to do. And you pick out what order you're going to do them in. You can choose. But let's start with one at a time. Okay, I'm going to go pick up all the books in my room and put them on the bookshelves. And not just like all over the bookshelves, but like, in order kind of vertically. Or I'm gonna go and get all my clothes and put all my clothes in the laundry basket, whatever it is, and breaking it into those little chunks, but also giving that explicit instruction, like let's break it down for them. If they're not doing it, there's something that's missing there, so we want to support that. The other piece sometimes when we talk about giving supports and we talk about accommodations, I often hear from parents or teachers about what are we doing? Well, are we accommodating by giving somebody, so when we talk about accommodations, it's kind of like giving somebody a step stool to reach something on a high shelf, right? They need that step stool to be able to reach it. Or are we enabling? If we're giving them those tools and supports, are we just making it too easy for them and they're not going to learn how to be independent? And the way that I really frame this is if we're giving tools and supports, our goal with the kids for those supports, like the idea with the index cards and putting the steps down on index cards and then reorganizing them. We show them how to do that, but that's an accommodation, but eventually they can do that on their own. And if that works for them, we want them to be independent with that. Or maybe we just give them a little bit less support with it. And ultimately, if we are running around behind the scenes, doing all of the things for our kids, like my husband who's sometimes, he's in Missouri, I could throw him under the bus all the time. He's not gonna know. He's not watching everybody. I'm sure he's got other things to do than listen to me talk. But his whole thing is like with the dishes. We ask the kids to help with the dishes. We ask the kids to help with the trash. And sometimes he's like, I just don't even want to have the conversation. He just wants to do it himself. Like, that's fine, but that's enabling, right? You're not giving them any tools to learn how to be independent with that and how to have that, ability to manage those expectations. And accommodation is when we bring kids into a process and say, okay, what do you need? How do we know that this will help? How can we make sure that it's working? How do we know that you're making progress in this area? If you're not making progress in this area, how will we know that we need to revise it? Or if you are making progress, how do we know that maybe you don't need that accommodation anymore? And so this might look like a lot of different things. You might have this conversation with your teachers, but the bottom line is we want kids to be part of that process. And ultimately, we want them to be independent of this. We talked about that asynchrony and that executive functioning that develops a little bit slower for those gifted kids. That's going to catch up. If you have a child who's twice exceptional, probably if they struggle with executive functioning, that's probably going to be something that they may struggle with throughout their lives, but ultimately they still need to be independent about how they handle it. It might be setting 12 alarms on their phone, whatever it is that works for them, right? I know for me, for example, my husband always teases me because I won't use a digital planner. I have to have my paper planner. The thing about a digital planner, I need to be able to have it on my paper so I can open it up and so I can see all the things. It's kind of like my titles, like I'm just really visual that way. And if I have to have it on my phone and I'm looking for it and I have to scroll down, my working memory doesn't work. That's an accommodation that works for me, but nobody's in charge of that for me. Like I just know that that's what works. So we all have accommodations that we use on a daily basis. They're just the things that we find that work for us. So we want to encourage kids to experiment and find what will work for them to help support those areas where they might be struggling. So the last piece here is the PATS process. And this is a conversational piece. This is how we get kids buy-in. how do we actually help them understand what the goals are, how they're going to reach this? And so ultimately, what this really comes from is it actually comes from like motivational interviewing specifically, which is a therapeutic model, which talks about having a conversation with kids and bringing them into this process and helping them have an awareness of like what the goal is and then how we can help them. And so, you know, we really want kids to be directly involved with this. So I'm going to align this PATS process with this activity that we can do where we're thinking like a scientist with our kids. So what I mean by that specifically is if we want our kids to attempt a new strategy or attempt a new skill, we really need to make sure that it doesn't feel like it's pass fail. That I'm either going to succeed or it's going to be terrible and you know I'm going to just mess it up again. The thing about for our kids is that they all know the scientific method. They've been taught the scientific method since they were in kindergarten. They all know about developing a hypothesis and coming up with a method and collecting data. And that's kind of what we want to encourage them to do as they work on building these executive functioning skills. So the nice thing about a hypothesis is that it's automatically non-judgmental. Because what is the goal of a hypothesis? You're either going to prove it or disprove it. There's no right or wrong. It's okay. So, for example, the hypothesis might be, you know, let's just see if these index cards help you for doing this multi-step process and breaking it into these smaller chunks, and then we'll collect some data about it, right? And if it works, great, and if it doesn't, that's okay, but let's just give it a shot and see. It's very collaborative, and it allows them to feel like they have some ownership over it. It allows us to be curious about it, like, I wonder what would happen, I wonder if this would work in. And we could frame our questions that way. And then a detective perspective, like we're gonna just kind of have an open mind about it. We're trying to gather information. So the first step in the PASS process aligns with the step one, defining the problem. We need to help our kids define the problem, and we probably know what the problem is, right? We would like them to also know what the problem is, and maybe not even with us specifically saying it. And so what we can really do is we can, this is the key in the PASS process is purpose. How do we help kids recognize what their purpose is? And kids have a purpose. So what's important to you? What are some of the things that you want to do? What are some ways that you like, you know, things that you like to do to spend your time? What are some things that you would like to do to do better, or that would make your life better? Longer term goals, all of these conversations. And then one of the questions though that's great is you ask them on a scale of 1 to 10. Let's say you identify a purpose or something that maybe would help them reach that, you know, whatever that purpose might be. On a scale of 1 to 10, how motivated are you to start on this, to try this? And then whatever number they say, the follow-up question is, why didn't you choose a lower number? And so they say, well, you know, I want to get more organized. I want to, you know, really work on getting my work turned in on time. Okay, well, how motivated are you to do that? Well, like maybe like a 5 or a 6. Why didn't you choose a lower number? Well, I didn't choose a lower number because, you know, I know it's pretty important to me and I'm successful at it sometimes. So when you ask why didn't they choose a lower number, you're asking them to outline what their strengths are. What do they feel good about? What are the reasons that they really want to move forward with that? So you help them identify their purpose, and that ends up becoming the problem. Like, what is the thing that you want to focus on? What's the area where you want to grow? And we know that kids have all kinds of purposes, right? All different things that they can be, you know, related to you. And for what it's worth, if you're building executive functioning skills, we want to take a strengths-based approach. So what do I mean by that? So Dr. Matt Zakreski is a friend, he's a psychologist, he's been on the podcast, and we did a podcast talking about strengths-based instruction specifically. And I asked him, I'm like, well, how do you do this? When you're working with your clients, how do you integrate strengths-based supports? He said, okay, well, let me turn that around and go. What's something that you're always trying to work on? And so I said, executive functioning skills, I'm always trying to improve. Like, there's always room for growth in that area for me. And so he said, okay, well, if I was working with you on building executive functioning skills, I would suggest that we start working on that within the context of your podcast, as opposed to like doing your taxes. Right? Because you start with the area that you're strong. I like doing the podcast. I enjoy doing the podcast. It's something I already feel good about. So let's build executive functioning within that context, as opposed to an area that's already really hard and I'm dragging my feet to do it. That's what I mean by that strengths-based support. So we can help kids figure out like what is the thing that they're most interested in, and then let's work on the task initiation in that area, or let's work on the organization in that area, because that's just a good starting point for them. So our next step here, again, related to the task process and becoming aware of the problem, is just that awareness piece. You know, so for them really to recognize, like, how do you learn? What are the areas that you need to improve? And having that ability to move toward that. So after you've defined the problem, what comes next in the scientific method, do you know? Remember? Oh, come on. But there you go. Great hypothesis. This was beaten into your skulls a long time ago. The problem is still there. You just gotta like, pull it up. Okay. So yeah, you create a hypothesis. Okay, so we know what the problem is. What's our hypothesis? What do we think is going to work? What do we think, what do we want to try? And so the task process, so we had purpose, awareness, and now we have the task. What is the task? What is something that you want to do that's going to help you reach that goal that we set earlier during the purpose and awareness conversation? We have that problem. And so let's just figure out what it is. How do the tasks help implement your strengths? Like where's the alignment there? And helping them really define specifically what they want to test out. So this might be a process. It might be, for example, well, I'm going to use, have any of you ever heard of the Pomodoro technique? So the Pomodoro technique is really to help with kids, well, not kids, I use it, it's to help with sustained attention. And basically, Pomodoro, I think in Italian means tomato, which is like, it comes from the word like for a tomato timer, which we would call more like an egg timer, where you set a timer for a certain amount of time. And your goal is to, I'm going to work until that timer goes off, and then I have a set break and I'm going to take a break. So for example, when I've written my books, I've used this. It's like, I'll say I'm going to write for an hour and then I'm going to take 15 minutes. I'm going to go change the line. I'm so excited. My life is so great. And that's a break. But it gives you that deadline and you can make it work. It could be 15 minutes and 5 minutes. It could be whatever it might be. So maybe that's the task. It's like, I'm going to work on implementing, improving my sustained attention by working for a certain amount of time and having it ready and using a timer to manage that. So that could be the task, but I'm going to do it maybe in an area, that might be a strength for me. So after we define the problem, we create a hypothesis. Do you remember what's next? Yeah, but before you test it out, before you collect any data, you have to create a method. Yep. See, I knew it would come back. You have to come up with a method. How are you going to test this? You have this task. I'm going to use the Pomodoro technique. I'm going to try to improve my sustained attention. So what do we want to do here? Well, we have to identify the hurdles. What are the things that are the barriers? Right? We want to have that conversation and just really recognize, like, what are the things that people work? What are the things that might get in the way? And then let's come up with our process specifically. So every day when I get home from school, I'm going to use the timer on the, Google Home or the Alexa or whatever. And I'm going to work for 30 minutes on my homework. And then I'm going to take a 15-minute break. And then I'm going to work for another 30 minutes. And then take another 15-minute break until I'm finished. And so I know that the hurdles to this might be that, the dog is kind of distracting to me, or, I might end up not really feeling like I want to do the work. I want to do something else, or I might hear my friends outside playing, whatever it is. So then you kind of develop a plan as well for how you're going to handle, what those hurdles might be and overcome those. So as you got your method, then you've also got to collect your data, analyze the data, and evaluate that information and make changes. So when I talk about evaluating the data, collecting and evaluating data, we want to make sure that our kids are, how do we know if the Pomodoro technique is working in that situation? We can make a tally sheet, we can make a check sheet, we could just have them do a little rating scale. Like, let's come up on a rating scale of 1 through 10. And then when you're done with your homework that day, let's rate how well it worked or how well it didn't. And so then that's where the self-regulation comes in, where we start to really build our awareness and then we can modify things. This is all metacognition. This is thinking about thinking, what works and what doesn't. attempting new tasks. If it hasn't worked in the past, how do we do something different so that maybe we can improve something in the future? And this is a skill that will help your kids as they go through life. This is not something that's like, oh, we're just doing it for this. We, as adults, do this all the time when we have a problem. We might not do this explicitly, but we're often like, I'm just going to try this other thing, or I found this new app that's going to help me, manage my budget, and I'm going to see if it works. I'm going to, and basically we're collecting data. We might not be doing it with paper pencil, but if it doesn't work, then we stop it. We do something different. But we can help kids really understand that. And then once we have that data, we can look at the successes. What worked? Let's take the parts that worked. Let's leave the rest. Let's evolve. Let's go on to the next thing. Really helping them come up with those pieces. So the CAPS process there is using that scientific method, but then going through and having those conversations, looking for the purpose, the awareness, finding the task, addressing the hurdles, and then looking at the successes. And hopefully these are some ways that really you can help your kids build some of those skills for what it's worth. Maybe it's not executive functioning that they're struggling with. Maybe they're struggling with emotional regulation. Same thing, it still works, whatever it might be. Maybe they're dealing with anxiety, whatever, fill it in. But walking kids through that process, giving them the explicit instructions, helping them find tools and strategies that they can implement and be independent with. Those are all things that will help empower them to feel more successful so that they can move forward with all of those pieces. So here are some podcast episodes that I would recommend if you'd like to listen to podcasts. These are all related to executive functioning. And so they're really some great episodes there. So I would check those out. And I think we've got about 5 minutes or so for questions, if anyone has anything specific. Yes.
After setting up some of the tools and things and working on it for a while, when is the point where between the enabling and the independence of learning that, or not being there for a specific age or whatever, but at what point do you feel like the person can seek more help for the?
Oh, like, okay, we're not making as much progress.
Like,
Yeah. Depends on how much patience you have. Depends on how much tolerance you have to handle it, and at the point where you're like, I can't do it anymore, go find somebody who can help, guide that process. I mean, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer there. I think it really has to do with, and I guess I thought if you're really feeling like you're spinning your wheels and you're making no progress, okay, then what's going on there? And maybe that's the time to see if there's something else that maybe you're missing, or maybe there's just something, something that your kid needs that's a little bit different that you haven't quite come across yet. But I would say in general, like if you feel like you're making progress and you're satisfied with the progress that you're making, then continue with that. You might also recognize, for example, like you might be making progress, but you're like, okay, this should be going much faster. And sometimes if you do have a clinician or somebody that you're checking in with, or they might say, no, you're good. And sometimes that's just reassuring to hear, like, okay, I'm not, we're making progress there. It's hard to know though, because we have our kids, obviously, but even if you have, I've got 3 kids, you cannot compare any one of them to the others. They're so different as far as their strengths and struggles and what that trajectory is like for them. So, because I work with a lot of kids, I have a lot of data there, but a lot of parents don't. So you're kind of just going by instinct with something.
Does this ever present difficulty in environments? So, kids, executive functioning, not significantly different, but.
No, yeah, totally. It definitely can. So, so when we talk about neurodivergence, one of the things we often talk about is masking or camouflaging. So for example, one of the things that a lot of ADHD kids will end up doing, they actually become perfectionists because that's their way to compensate for those mistakes that they make. And so they become hyper vigilant about making sure that they're not making those types of mistakes in certain environments. So at school, they might have their teachers are like, no, there's not that. I have no idea what you're talking about. And then at home, you're like, okay, what's happening here? It has to do with expectations. It has to do with different environments. It has to do with levels of interest in varying, I will tell you just, so my 9-year-old, who's in 4th grade this year, he apparently just decided he wasn't going to do work. And it was kind of hard and he didn't like it with that thoughts. And so he literally, it's the 11th day of school and we're sitting in the principal's office with the principal, the counselor, the classroom teacher, who is a first year teacher, bless her soul. And, which, you know, separate issue, but, anyway, you know, but he doesn't like that feeling of things being difficult. And so, he literally, he would sit there and he would get out a book and he would read a book. I will just tell you what, the thing that made me laugh about this more than anything was he had some benchmark tests that they were doing just a few days maybe after the meeting that we had. And, I asked him, well, what did you go ahead and do the benchmark test today? How did you do on that? He goes, well, yeah, I can't just not do a test. Okay, whatever, anyways, you know, but it's been interesting to kind of just, you know, different kids handle it in different environments. He's kind of got used to this swing of things, but I was like, this is not how I thought we were going to start out here. But anyway, yes.
little bit about how these interventions or these recordings will help for a younger child, like, they don't
Sure.
feel you have
Yeah.
everybody-
Can you repeat that? Can you repeat the question?
What's that? Oh, yeah, sure. So the question is, what might this look like for a younger child?
Thank you.
And so you can use this with younger kids too. It might be a little bit harder to have that past conversation, like with their purpose, but you can talk about their interests, their strengths. But here's an example. I don't know, this is the one that comes to mind for me with the young kid. This was like a kindergarten student, and we were working on that, using that scientific method. And he was getting, this is when I was working as a school counselor, he was getting in trouble in class for blurting out it without raising his hand. And it was pretty disruptive to the classroom. And so what we ended up coming up with was we just brainstormed, we came up with a method and a, you know, hypothesis. It's like, you know, and I just wanted him to build more awareness of when he was blurting things out. So we've got a little index card, we put a T-chart on it. Every time he called out and realized that he called out, he was going to put a tally on one side. Every time he wanted to call out but didn't, he was going to put a tally on the other side. And so very basic, very simple, but just to try to really bring that to his awareness. And so then we just taped that on his desk so that he could track that. And then we came back and processed about it, what worked and what didn't. And it was interesting because the teacher asked specifically, they said, well, do you want me to keep an index card too, so that I can keep accurate information so you can see if it's, you know, how he's tracking it, if he's tracking it accurately? And I was like, no. I was like, I want him, the whole point is for him to build his self-awareness about when he's doing this and when he's not. And so then the teacher said, well, what if he lies? And I was like, I don't care. It's not a discipline. I'm not doing this for a discipline piece. I'm doing this to help him understand what's happening when he's learning things out and what's working when he's not. And it's just about building that awareness. So you could do that with, you know, just do it on a smaller scale. Figure out something, you know, so if, you know, little kiddos, it's like, you know, can you put your backpack on the little hook where it gets hung up after, I don't know, whatever it might be, but find a way to track it. But the biggest piece of it is make sure that they're the ones in charge of it. It can't be, oh, you did a good job putting your backpack and everything today, so now you get, you know, a tally or a sticker or a check mark or whatever it is. We want them to self-evaluate. We can guide them through that. We can have that conversation with them. How do you think it went? But we don't want to be the ones who are the arbiters of the success or failure, because all that does is lead to some of that learned helplessness or that dependence. Yes. Yeah, so the question is, at what point do you look at medication? It depends on what the issue is, first of all. Medication is a really hard thing with kids. You know, for adults, we might feel comfortable taking medications on our own. It's really hard to give your kids medication because kids are not great about really understanding or verbalizing what they're experiencing when they're taking medication. But I will tell you that medication is kind of like flipping on a switch. Okay, so here's a little bit more disclosure about my son. So you know what made the difference for him this year? We started him on a little bit of medication for anxiety. And all of a sudden he's able to overcome that fear of that perfectionism and not getting the work done, and he's engaging in the classrooms. Did I really want to start my 4th grader on anxiety meds? Of course not. But what's, in my mind, what's really the best and worst possible outcome about each of those things? What is he learning about himself, sitting there, getting in trouble every day? Sitting, then having to take the homework home because he's literally just not sitting there doing it. It's damaging our relationship because I'm then having to sit there after school and say, okay, we have to get this done because you didn't do it at school, right? And so the benefits outweigh the drawbacks. And so we try, the thing about medication that I will also just say is, if you try medication for your child, you talk to the doctor, clinician, whoever it is, and they suggest and think that it might be helpful. If you try it, you don't have to keep doing it. If you don't like it, if there's side effects, if you just don't like the way it changes their personality or whatever, you don't have to keep doing it. And, lots of people have varying opinions about that, but I will tell you that for some kids, medication is like turning on a light switch. It's like, I don't know, I just feel like there's so many kids who are struggling so much, and it's a tool. And it helps them be more open. Sometimes for kids, they don't necessarily have to be on it a long time, but sometimes the medication actually, like say I've been counseling somebody for a pretty long time, and we're making some progress, but not really. And finally, they decide to try some medication. It actually helps them then implement all of the skills that we've been learning all of that time. And then once they kind of build some of those skills while they're on the medication, then you can titrate off of it. But they then establish them those patterns and different things. So, how is it impacting their self-esteem? Like that's a big one. What are they learning about themselves? How are they labeling themselves? What is becoming their internal monologue about how they understand themselves? Like those are the biggest things for me. But if a kid's getting in trouble every day, and or they're having big emotional meltdowns, obviously they're not happy. And so those are some of the things that I look at, but I understand how hard of a decision that can be. So, anyway, I don't want to keep everybody because I know people have kids to get home to, things to do. I'm happy to stay and answer a few questions, but I'm really grateful that everyone came out tonight. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of the evening.
Thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. We greatly appreciate UPC helping us make sure that we can get this online for families. It will be on the
PVUPC YouTube channel.
UPC YouTube channel. Say that 3 times fast.
No.
So thank you so much. And Emily, thank you so much for coming. I greatly appreciate it. Have a wonderful evening.